The Montana wilderness stretched endlessly in every direction, blanketed in 3 feet of fresh snow that had fallen during the most vicious storm the region had seen in a decade. Marcus Thompson adjusted his wool coat and hefted his well-worn axe, preparing for another day of solitary work in the remote Glacier National Forest. At 42, Marcus had been cutting timber in these unforgiving mountains for over 15 years, and in all that time, he had spoken fewer words than most people did in a single day. It wasn't that Marcus couldn't speak. A childhood accident involving a logging chain had crushed his larynx when he was 8 years old, leaving him with a voice so rough and painful that he'd simply stopped trying to communicate verbally years ago. The silence had become his companion, as familiar as the weight of his axe or the bite of mountain air against his weathered, bearded face. He'd learned to communicate through gestures and written notes when absolutely necessary, but mostly he preferred the honest silence of the wilderness to the complicated noise of human society. Marcus lived alone in a small cabin 15 miles from the nearest neighbor, earning his living by cutting and selling timber to the mill in Whitefish. His life was simple, predictable, and peaceful, exactly the way he preferred it. He woke before dawn, worked until sunset, and spent his evenings reading by lamplight or maintaining his equipment. The mountains were his sanctuary, and the trees were his only confidants. This morning felt different, though. The storm had been fiercer than anything he'd experienced in years, with winds howling at over 60 miles per hour and snow falling, so thick it had been impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Even now, hours after the storm had passed, the wilderness seemed stunned into an unnatural quiet. No bird songs echoed through the towering pine trees. No squirrels chattered in the snow-heavy branches. Just the soft whisper of wind through snow-laden boughs and the steady crunch of Marcus's insulated boots as he made his way toward his planned cutting area. The storm had done significant damage to the forest. Marcus could see dozens of trees that had been snapped in half by the wind or crushed under the weight of accumulated snow and ice. Some of these fallen giants blocked the old logging road he typically used, forcing him to navigate around them through deeper snow that sometimes reached his waist. He was examining a massive pine that had fallen across his path, calculating the best way to cut it up and clear the road, when he heard it, a sound so faint and unexpected that he almost dismissed it as his imagination. But there it was again, a weak, muffled crying that seemed to come from somewhere beneath the snow near a cluster of trees that had been shattered by the storm. Marcus froze, his experienced ears straining to locate the source of the sound. In 15 years of working these mountains, he'd never heard anything quite like it. The crying came again, definitely human, definitely distressed, but strangely muffled as if it were coming from underground. Dropping his axe, Marcus began moving toward the sound, his heart rate quickening as possibilities raced through his mind. The crying grew stronger as he approached an area where several large trees had fallen in a chaotic tangle, their massive trunks creating a natural fortress of fallen timber. That's when he saw them, tire tracks in the snow, barely visible but definitely there, leading straight toward a steep embankment that dropped away into a heavily wooded ravine. Marcus's blood ran cold as he realized what had happened. During the storm, a vehicle had gone off the mountain road and crashed into the ravine below. The crying was coming from somewhere near the edge of the embankment, almost buried under the debris from the fallen trees. Marcus began digging frantically with his gloved hands, his breath coming in sharp puffs in the frigid air. The snow was deep and packed hard by the storm's winds, but he could hear the crying getting stronger as he dug, more urgent and desperate. When his fingers finally touched fabric, Marcus's breath caught in his throat. There, wrapped in a thin pink blanket, and somehow wedged between 2 fallen branches that had protected her from the worst of the snowfall, was a baby girl. She couldn't have been more than 6 months old, her tiny face red from cold, but her eyes bright and alert. How she had survived an entire night in these brutal conditions was nothing short of miraculous. Marcus lifted the infant carefully, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he cradled her against his chest. She was cold, dangerously cold, but alive and breathing steadily. Her small fingers immediately gripped his thick coat, and she looked up at him with dark eyes that seemed far too wise and trusting for someone so young. Despite the trauma she had obviously endured, she stopped crying the moment he picked her up, as if she instinctively knew she was finally safe. Looking around the crash site more carefully, Marcus began to piece together the tragic story. The tire tracks showed that a car had skidded on the icy mountain road during the height of the storm, broken through the guardrail, and tumbled down the steep embankment into the ravine below. The baby must have been thrown clear during the crash and somehow landed in the protective shelter created by the fallen trees. Marcus climbed down into the ravine carefully, still holding the baby close to keep her warm with his body heat. At the bottom, nearly buried under snow and debris, he found the twisted wreckage of a small sedan. The roof was completely crushed, and ice had already begun forming on the broken windows. Inside the car, Marcus discovered the heartbreaking remainder of the story. A young woman in her 20s, the baby's mother, he assumed, was still trapped behind the steering wheel. She had died on impact, her face peaceful despite the violence of the crash. In the back seat, Marcus found a diaper bag that had somehow remained intact. It contained bottles, formula, baby clothes, and a few personal items, but no identification beyond a hospital bracelet on the baby's tiny wrist that read Baby Sarah, along with a birth date that indicated she was exactly 5 months old. There were no other passengers in the car, no purse or wallet that might help identify the mother. Marcus realized that this young woman and her baby had been traveling alone through one of the most remote and dangerous mountain passes in Montana during a blizzard, a decision that had cost the mother her life and had very nearly claimed her daughter as well. The nearest town, Whitefish, was a grueling 20 miles away through some of the most treacherous mountain terrain in the region. The storm had knocked out phone lines throughout the area and made all the mountain roads completely impassable for vehicles. Marcus knew from experience that it would be at least 3 or 4 days before snowplows could clear the main road, and help wouldn't reach this remote crash site for at least a week. The baby needed medical attention immediately. She was suffering from exposure and dehydration, and Marcus could see signs of hypothermia in her pale skin and lethargic movements. Every minute they delayed increased the chance that she wouldn't survive. There was only one choice. He would have to carry her to safety himself, on foot, across 20 miles of mountain wilderness in the aftermath of the worst storm in years. Marcus carefully searched the diaper bag and selected only the most essential items: bottles, formula, diapers, and extra blankets. Everything else would have to be left behind to reduce weight. He wrapped Sarah in his own thick wool scarf in addition to her blanket, creating a makeshift carrier that would keep her warm and secure against his chest, while leaving his hands free for the treacherous journey ahead. Before leaving the crash site, Marcus took a moment to say a silent prayer for the young mother who would never see her daughter grow up. He covered her body with a spare jacket, a gesture of respect that seemed inadequate, but was all he could offer. Then, with baby Sarah tucked safely against his chest, Marcus began the most important journey of his life. The first mile was brutal. The terrain near the crash site was steep and rocky, made treacherous by ice and deep snow. Marcus had to move carefully, testing each step to ensure he wouldn't slip and endanger the precious life he carried. Sarah seemed to sense the gravity of their situation and remained quiet, her tiny body relaxing against his chest as if she understood that this silent stranger was her only hope for survival. As they climbed higher into the mountains, following the old logging trail that would eventually connect to the main road leading to Whitefish, the wind picked up and the temperature continued to drop. Marcus could feel Sarah shivering against his chest, despite the multiple layers of insulation, and he knew they were in a desperate race against time and the unforgiving Montana winter. By the time they reached the 5-mile mark, Marcus's legs were already beginning to feel the strain of carrying the extra weight through the deep snow. He had been walking for nearly 3 hours, fighting his way through drifts that sometimes reached his thighs, following a logging trail that was barely visible under the fresh snowfall. Each step required tremendous effort as he broke through the crusty surface layer and sank into the soft powder beneath. Sarah had been remarkably quiet during the first part of their journey, but Marcus could feel her becoming restless against his chest. When she finally began to cry, a thin, weak sound that spoke of hunger and cold, Marcus knew it was time for their first stop. He found a relatively sheltered spot behind a massive boulder and carefully prepared one of the bottles from the diaper bag. Feeding Sarah in the sub-zero temperatures proved to be more challenging than Marcus had anticipated. The formula was nearly frozen, and he had to warm it against his body for several minutes before it was suitable for the baby. Sarah drank eagerly, her tiny hands gripping the bottle with surprising strength, and Marcus felt a surge of hope. If she was still drinking and alert, they had a fighting chance. But as he prepared to continue their journey, Marcus realized that the weather was getting worse, not better. The wind had picked up significantly, driving the snow horizontally across the mountain slopes and reducing visibility to just a few yards. The temperature was dropping rapidly as they climbed higher, and Marcus estimated it was now well below zero. The next section of the trail was the most dangerous part of their entire route, a narrow path that wound along the edge of a deep canyon, with a sheer drop of several hundred feet on one side and steep rock walls on the other. Under normal conditions, Marcus could navigate this section easily, but carrying a baby while fighting through snow and ice made every step a potential disaster. Marcus tied an additional rope around his waist and secured it to his belt, creating a safety line that would at least give Sarah a chance if he slipped and fell. Then, moving with painstaking care, he began the treacherous traverse along the canyon edge. The wind was fierce here, unobstructed by trees, and it tried to push Marcus off the narrow path with each gust. Snow and ice made the footing treacherous, and more than once he had to grab onto rock outcroppings to keep from losing his balance. Sarah seemed to sense the danger and remained perfectly still, as if she understood that any sudden movement could be fatal for both of them. It took Marcus nearly 2 hours to cover the 3 miles of canyon trail, normally a 40-minute walk. By the time they reached the relative safety of the forest on the other side, his nerves were frayed and his body was shaking from a combination of cold, exhaustion, and adrenaline. But they weren't even halfway to Whitefish yet, and the most challenging part of the journey still lay ahead. As afternoon faded toward evening, Marcus found himself struggling with increasingly difficult conditions. The snow continued to fall heavily, making it hard to follow the trail, and the cold was becoming so intense that he could feel it penetrating even his heavy winter clothing. More importantly, he could tell that Sarah was beginning to suffer from the prolonged exposure, despite his best efforts to keep her warm. During their second feeding stop, Marcus noticed that Sarah's lips were taking on a bluish tinge, a clear sign of hypothermia. Her movements were becoming sluggish, and she had trouble finishing her bottle. Marcus knew that if he couldn't find shelter and warmth soon, the baby wouldn't survive the night. That's when he remembered the old ranger station, abandoned for nearly a decade, but still standing somewhere ahead on the trail. Marcus had sheltered there during storms before, and while it was in rough condition, it had a working fireplace and basic supplies. If he could find it in the gathering darkness and swirling snow, it might save both their lives. The problem was that the ranger station was located on a side trail that branched off from the main logging road, and in these conditions, it would be easy to miss the turnoff entirely. Marcus had to rely on his intimate knowledge of these mountains, reading subtle signs in the landscape that most people would never notice. As darkness fell and the temperature plummeted even further, Marcus pushed himself harder than he ever had before. His feet were becoming numb from frostbite, his shoulders ached terribly from carrying Sarah's weight, and exhaustion was making him stumble more frequently. But every time he looked down at the tiny face barely visible within the bundle of blankets against his chest, he found new reserves of strength and determination. The snow was now falling so heavily that Marcus could barely see 10 feet ahead, and he had to navigate primarily by feel and instinct. He used his axe to probe ahead for obstacles and to mark trees as he passed, creating a trail that he could follow back if he got lost. Then, just as Marcus was beginning to fear that he had missed the turnoff to the ranger station, he spotted a familiar landmark, a distinctive lightning-struck pine tree that stood like a sentinel beside the narrow side trail. Fighting through another 100 yards of knee-deep snow, Marcus finally saw the dark outline of the small log cabin emerging from the white wilderness like a miracle. The ranger station was in rough condition. The door hung crooked on its hinges, several windows were broken, and snow had drifted inside through gaps in the walls. But the stone fireplace was intact, and there was still a stack of dry firewood left by the last occupant years ago. Marcus kicked in the door and stumbled inside, his legs finally giving out as he collapsed beside the fireplace. He carefully laid Sarah on a relatively clean blanket and immediately began building a fire, his half-frozen fingers struggling with matches and kindling. When the flames finally caught and began to spread warmth through the small cabin, Marcus felt tears of relief freezing on his cheeks. He wrapped Sarah in his own coat in addition to her blankets and held her close to the fire, rubbing her tiny hands and feet to restore circulation. For the next 4 hours, they stayed in the abandoned cabin while Marcus fought to save Sarah's life. He fed her every hour, kept the fire burning brightly, and gradually watched as her color improved and her movements became more animated. By the time he felt confident enough to continue their journey, dawn was beginning to break over the mountains, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. The final stretch to Whitefish was the most grueling test of Marcus's physical and mental endurance. His body was running on pure adrenaline and willpower. His feet were severely frostbitten, his shoulders felt like they were on fire, and exhaustion clouded his vision until he was navigating more by instinct than sight. But Sarah's steady breathing against his chest and the occasional movement of her tiny hands reminded him constantly why he couldn't give up. This innocent child depended entirely on him, and he would rather die than let her down. The last 5 miles took Marcus nearly 4 hours to complete. He had to stop frequently to rest and to feed Sarah, and several times he became disoriented in the endless expanse of white wilderness. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the forest began to thin out, and the terrain became less steep. When the first buildings of Whitefish finally came into view through the trees, Marcus felt an overwhelming surge of emotion that nearly brought him to his knees. They had done it. They had both survived an impossible journey through some of the most dangerous wilderness in North America. The town's small hospital appeared ahead, its emergency room lights glowing like a beacon of hope in the early morning light. Marcus summoned the last of his strength and stumbled through the automatic doors, his legs finally giving out completely as nurses rushed to help. "Help, baby," Marcus managed to croak, his damaged voice barely audible after years of silence. It was the first word he had spoken aloud in over a decade, forced out by desperation and love for a child who wasn't even his own. Medical personnel immediately took Sarah from his arms, rushing her into the emergency room while other staff members helped Marcus onto a gurney. As consciousness began to fade, the last thing he saw was Sarah's tiny face disappearing behind swinging doors, and the last thing he heard was a doctor saying that both patients were going to be fine. Hours later, when Marcus woke up in a hospital bed with warm blankets, heated for fluids, and medications for his frostbite, the first thing he asked about was Sarah. Dr. Emily Chun, the emergency room physician who had treated them both, sat beside his bed with a warm smile and tears in her eyes. "She's going to be completely fine," Dr. Chun said softly. "Mild hypothermia and dehydration, but nothing that won't heal completely with proper care. What you did out there, carrying a baby 20 miles through a blizzard and sub-zero temperatures, it's nothing short of miraculous. Another few hours in those conditions, and we would have lost her for certain." Marcus nodded weakly, relief flooding through his exhausted body. Through the window of his room, he could see the mountains where he had found Sarah, their peaks gleaming white and pristine in the afternoon sun. Somewhere out there, a young mother lay buried beneath the snow, but her daughter was alive and safe because a silent man had refused to abandon her. In the days that followed, as the story spread throughout the community and then across the nation, Marcus found himself uncomfortable with the praise and media attention. He had simply done what needed to be done, what any decent person would have done in his situation. The fact that it required extraordinary physical endurance and determination was beside the point. When an innocent life is at stake, you do whatever it takes. Sarah was placed with a loving foster family, while authorities searched for relatives. Marcus visited her regularly during his own recovery, and though he rarely spoke, Sarah always seemed to recognize him. She would reach for him with tiny hands and smile when he held her, as if she remembered their shared journey through the wilderness and the bond they had forged in those desperate hours. 3 months later, when Sarah's great-aunt was finally located in Oregon and came to adopt her, Marcus was there to say goodbye. The woman, a teacher named Margaret who had been searching for her missing niece since the accident, thanked Marcus with tears streaming down her face, promising to tell Sarah about the silent hero who had saved her life when she was old enough to understand the magnitude of his sacrifice. Marcus returned to his work in the mountains, his routine largely unchanged, but his heart somehow fuller than it had ever been. He had discovered that sometimes the most profound acts of love require no words at all, just the willingness to carry someone else's burden, no matter how heavy, no matter how far, no matter what it costs. In the silence of the forest, where only the wind spoke and the trees listened, Marcus Thompson continued his solitary work. But now he carried with him the knowledge that one snowy morning, when it mattered most, his quiet strength had been enough to save a precious life. The 20-mile journey through hell had ended, but the bond forged in those frozen mountains would last forever, a testament to the power of human compassion and the extraordinary things that ordinary people can accomplish when love demands it.